On the morning of August 23rd, 1993, Crystal Perry got ready for work in the bedroom of her small white wooden house in Bridgeton, Maine. And she was excited because it was her 30th birthday. Crystal was very attractive with pale freckled skin, light blue eyes, and thick, bright red hair. Her hair actually was so bright that it made her almost immediately recognizable wherever she went in her small town. And on the rare occasions when Crystal went out to a bar or went dancing with her friends, her looks made her the center of attention. Or they made her an object of desire for men watching her from a distance who couldn't get the nerve up to go talk to her. In her bedroom, Crystal finished getting dressed for work, and then she called out to her 11-year-old daughter, Sarah, to let her know it was time to go. But Sarah was already standing behind her mom, and she shouted, "Happy birthday!" Crystal was startled, but she turned around and gave Sarah a big hug. Crystal had only been 18 years old when Sarah was born, and she had actually only been 15 years old when she married Sarah's father. At such a young age, Crystal's parents had to give their legal permission for the marriage to take place. But the marriage didn't last, and Crystal had gotten divorced when Sarah was a little girl. Since then, Crystal and Sarah had pretty much been on their own, and they were as close as a mother and daughter could get. They spent almost every night together, watching movies, reading books, and talking and laughing in their house. Even as Sarah got older, Crystal still made it a point to tuck her in before bed, and sometimes she would even sing to her until she fell asleep. And on that morning of her 30th birthday, Crystal was heading out to her job at a local shoe factory that she had only taken just so she could make enough money to afford the little house where she and her daughter lived. The work Crystal did, sewing parts of shoes by hand, was totally backbreaking, and she would come home from work at night feeling totally tired and smelling of chemicals from the factory. But Crystal thought the long hours and hard work was all worth it because Sarah had a home and a room of her own. Crystal and Sarah walked outside, they got into Crystal's car in the driveway, and drove down the road through Brighton. Their house was secluded and surrounded by woods, and there were only a few houses nearby. But after a short drive, they pulled up to the house of a family friend where Sarah was going to spend the day. Crystal gave her daughter a kiss, told her she loved her, and then waved goodbye as Sarah walked up to the house. Then Crystal drove off and headed to work. When Crystal was a few minutes away from the shoe factory, she slowed down and stared out the windshield. There were these black balloons tied to a telephone pole. It was a weird sight, and Crystal didn't know what the balloons were for. And then things got even weirder when she saw more black balloons tied to telephone poles at regular intervals along the road. Then, when she was just outside of work, she saw even more black balloons, but this time they were attached to a huge sign that said, "Happy 30th, Crystal." Crystal nearly slammed on her brakes, and she almost started crying out of happiness. She couldn't believe her friends and coworkers had taken the time to set all this up just to make her feel special on her birthday. Then she started laughing when she realized they'd chosen black balloons because she was 30 years old now. Crystal parked her car and walked into work, and there were even more balloons and signs waiting for her. And that day, they had a huge party for her at the factory, but that was just the beginning of Crystal's birthday celebration. That night at the house, Crystal made dinner, and Sarah set the table. Crystal's boyfriend, Dennis Butler, was on his way over to join them for Crystal's birthday dinner, and Sarah was very excited. She liked Dennis because he was funny and nice to her, and he didn't talk to her like she was a little kid. Crystal was happy that Dennis was good with Sarah and that Sarah liked him, but Crystal still wasn't sure about her own relationship with Dennis. Dennis was about to turn 20 years old, but he worked full-time and he'd actually already been married before, so he seemed older than he was. But Crystal still just felt totally strange about the 10-year age gap between them. Still, Crystal and Dennis always had a good time together, and she knew finding the right guy in a small town wasn't always easy. The tourists who came to Bridgeton, Maine from all across New England saw it as a quaint little city with stunning natural beauty and charming shops and restaurants. But the people who lived there knew there was actually a side of the town that the tourists did not see. Drug use and drug dealing had been a problem in the area for years. In fact, one of Dennis's old high school classmates who lived not too far from Crystal, a guy named Michael Hutchinson, was known to show up to bars in town or just to walk around the streets totally high on cocaine. So, as Crystal put the finishing touches on dinner, she told herself that at least Dennis had not fallen into that kind of lifestyle. And it was her birthday, so she just wanted to be happy and have a good time and not spend the night worrying about her future with Dennis. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the front door, and so Sarah walked across the linoleum kitchen floor, went through the small living room, and opened the door, and there was Dennis. Dennis said hello to Sarah and gave her a big hug, and then he shouted happy birthday to Crystal. Dennis was tall and thin with dark hair and a square jaw, and he wore a gold earring in one of his ears. He went into the kitchen, gave Crystal a kiss, and then handed her a birthday card and a present. And a few minutes later, Crystal, Sarah, and Dennis sat down at the kitchen table and had dinner, and then they ate the birthday cake. After dinner and cake, Sarah helped her mom clear the dishes and put them in the sink. Then she handed her mom a small box with a bow on it. Crystal opened the present, and right away she got choked up. Sarah had gotten her this little pewter figurine of a warrior woman holding a sword, a perfect symbol of a single mother who fought as hard as she could to take care of her daughter. The three of them went into the living room and talked for a while. Then at some point, Sarah felt tired, so she got up, said goodnight to her mom and Dennis, and headed up to her bedroom. Crystal didn't tuck Sarah in that night because she stayed on the couch talking to Dennis. And so Sarah lay in bed thinking that Dennis and her mom might get married soon, and the thought of that made her happy. But as Sarah began to drift off to sleep, she began hearing yelling from the living room. And not long after that, Sarah heard the front door slam shut. And then she heard Dennis's car screeching out of the driveway. Sarah had no idea what had happened, but it obviously sounded bad, but she just stayed there in bed and tried to go to sleep. Crystal sat in the living room, crying on the couch. Her perfect birthday had fallen apart because Dennis had flown off the handle and gotten totally upset with her. She didn't actually know why he'd gotten upset. Maybe it was because she mentioned that she was not sure about their future, or maybe it was something Crystal wasn't even aware of. But the reason for the outburst didn't really matter to Crystal, because when Dennis had gotten angry, he got loud and scary. And she decided that was not the kind of guy she wanted around her daughter anymore. And so, before Dennis had stormed out of the house, Crystal had made it clear to him that their relationship was over. Crystal wiped the tears from her eyes, went to her room, and got ready for bed. Then she climbed under the covers and stared up at the ceiling. She knew the black balloons her friends and coworkers had gotten her for her birthday had been a joke, but for the first time, Crystal really did feel old. However, she hoped, now that she was 30, that her life would get a little calmer and easier, and that she wouldn't have any more nights that ended in shouting matches. But not long after Crystal's 30th birthday, for reasons even Crystal couldn't totally figure out, Crystal let Dennis right back into her life. Dennis spent the next several months trying to convince Crystal to put their past arguments behind them. He worked hard to prove that she could trust him, and he did everything he could to win her back. And Sarah found herself hoping that her mom and Dennis would make things work and stay together for good this time. And eventually, Dennis proposed to Crystal, and Crystal said yes. And for a time after the proposal, Crystal and Sarah thought their lives were about to change for good. And, along with Dennis, they would become this happy, loving family. On the night of May 11th, 1994, so 9 months after Crystal's 30th birthday, Crystal sat at the foot of Sarah's bed. Sarah was 12 years old now, but she still liked talking to her mom every night before she went to sleep. And for the past few weeks, Sarah had felt like she was comforting Crystal more than Crystal was comforting her when they talked at night. Because even though Crystal and Dennis were still engaged, their relationship had taken a bad turn again. They had started getting on each other's nerves again, and there were lots of nights that Sarah fell asleep listening to the sound of them screaming at each other in the living room. And there were other nights when Dennis was not at the house that the phone would ring, Crystal would answer, and she would hear screaming on the other line, and so she would just hang up. Sarah knew her mom was worried about the arguments and the angry phone calls, but whenever the mother and daughter were together, Crystal never let on that she was upset. She was always very positive and upbeat around her daughter. Crystal thought that no matter what happened with her and Dennis, that she and Sarah would be just fine. In the bedroom, Crystal said goodnight to Sarah, kissed her on the forehead, turned off the light, and walked out of the room. She went to her own bedroom, got undressed, and slipped on a blue terry cloth robe. Then she went to the living room, picked up a book, sat down on the couch, and started to read. Crystal could hear the rain falling on the roof. She loved that sound. It made her feel relaxed and safe somehow, like the rain would let her hide away from the rest of the world. But after midnight on May 12th, there was a sudden knock at the front door. Crystal put her book down and quickly walked across the living room. She didn't know who was there, but she didn't want their knocking to wake up her daughter. Crystal opened up the door just a little bit, and then she and the person standing outside talked briefly. Then Crystal smiled, opened the door wide, and let the visitor into the house. Just before 1 a.m., so less than an hour after this visitor had knocked on the door and come inside, Sarah woke up in her bed. She heard shouting coming from the kitchen, and so she figured her mom must be in another fight with Dennis. So Sarah closed her eyes and tried to go back to sleep. But then Sarah heard her mom scream, "No!" over and over and over. Sarah got scared and yelled to her mom, but Crystal just kept screaming, "No, no!" from the kitchen. Sarah immediately got out of bed and grabbed her white terry cloth robe that was similar to her mom's, put it on over her pajamas, and crept across her room to the door as quietly as possible. She wanted to help her mom, but she didn't know what to do, so she just crouched there by the door and listened. Then she heard something like boots stomping in the kitchen, and she heard a loud crash like something had fallen onto the floor. Sarah stayed in her room, too terrified to move. Then the house fell silent, and she thought about running out of her room, but suddenly she heard footsteps in the kitchen again, so she kept waiting inside of her bedroom by the door. Minutes later, Sarah heard the sound of the front door opening and shutting, and then there was no more sound coming from the living room or the kitchen. So Sarah stood up, flung her door open, and ran from her bedroom to the front of the house. She looked into the kitchen, and she screamed. Sarah saw her mother lying on the kitchen floor. There was blood on her robe and her legs, and near her was the phone that was off the hook. Sarah began yelling for her mother, but Crystal didn't respond. So Sarah grabbed the phone and tried 911, but the phone wasn't working. It just kept on beeping. So Sarah dropped the phone, ran out of the kitchen and out the front door into the rain. She felt wet grass and mud on her bare feet as she turned up the road and ran towards her closest neighbor's house. When she got there, Sarah rushed up to her neighbor's door and started knocking and screaming, but there was no movement inside and nobody answered the door. So Sarah turned and ran to the house across the street. She was cold, her robe was soaked, and her feet were caked in mud. She banged on the door as hard as she could, and she waited, but again, nobody answered the door. So Sarah turned again up the road and started running into town. By this point, her legs were burning, and she was totally out of breath. Sometime after about 1:30 in the morning, after Sarah had run for about 1.5 miles in the rain, she made it into town. She saw a light on inside a small Italian restaurant, so she ran to the restaurant door and started pounding on it. Then she noticed a light go on in the small apartment above the restaurant where the owners lived. And a few seconds later, a man and a woman, the restaurant owners, opened the door. The woman looked totally shocked when she saw Sarah standing there in the rain covered in mud. The woman wrapped her arms around Sarah and brought her into the restaurant. The owners asked what was going on, and Sarah said her mother had just been attacked at their home. The man took Sarah's hand and led her to the phone, while the woman went back upstairs to get Sarah a blanket and dry clothes. The man dialed 911 and told the operator that he needed police assistance immediately and then handed the phone to Sarah. And then Sarah spoke as clearly as she could and told the operator that her mom was at her house and that she was hurt and that there was blood everywhere. A few minutes after the 911 call, Detective Dick Pickett of the Maine State Police drove down a dark, rural stretch of road toward Crystal and Sarah's home. The rain was still falling, and even with the moon shining, visibility wasn't great. But Pickett saw the flashing lights of an ambulance, so he was able to find his way to the small white wooden house nestled in the trees. Pickett parked his car and stepped outside onto the wet, muddy ground. He was about average height, his brown hair was starting to thin, and he wore glasses. He walked into the house and he saw paramedics in the kitchen, but they had already pronounced Crystal Perry, the victim, dead at the scene. So Pickett walked over to Crystal's body. Pickett knew that small Maine towns might not be as picture-perfect as the tourist thought, but he was still shocked at what he saw, and he knew immediately that the news of this crime would cause fear and panic throughout Bridgeton. Pickett couldn't get over the amount of violence that had obviously taken place in this kitchen. His first thought was that this had to have been a crime of passion, carried out by someone who knew Crystal intimately, and whoever had done this had left a huge mess behind. There were bloody boot prints leading from the kitchen to the front door, and there was blood spatter all over the walls and kitchen counters. Soon after Pickett arrived, he was joined by several other state and local police officers and a state forensics team. Pickett led a few of the other officers on a sweep of the house, and they found their way into Sarah's bedroom, where they found the room was totally undisturbed, and there were even a few stuffed animals perfectly placed around the room where Sarah liked to keep them. After the 911 call, an ambulance had been dispatched to the Italian restaurant, and Sarah had been taken to the hospital. Pickett knew he would have to talk to her, but he couldn't imagine what that little girl was feeling at this moment. Pickett and the others checked Crystal's room next, but it also looked like it hadn't been disturbed. So Pickett believed whatever had happened to Crystal only took place in the living room and the kitchen. He walked back towards the kitchen and saw a photographer taking pictures of the scene and forensics officers studying the bloody boot prints on the floors. They hadn't found a murder weapon yet, but they still had plenty of evidence to work with. And Pickett saw a forensics officer crouched over Crystal's body, and she was fixated on one of Crystal's legs. She called Pickett and other forensics officers over, and she pointed to a small drop of blood on Crystal's leg that was almost a perfect circle. Pickett asked why that particular drop of blood was any different than the rest of the blood on Crystal's legs. The forensics officer looked up at him, pointed at the drop of blood again, and said they needed to take a sample of it. Because she knew a drop like that had to be what was known as a passive blood drop. That meant it did not come from Crystal. And in this particular case, the forensics officer said the blood could have only dripped off of someone who was standing right over Crystal and fallen onto her body after she was already dead. So the forensics officer was pretty confident that that drop of blood belonged to Crystal's killer. The forensics team took the blood sample and gathered other blood samples from around the room. But Pickett knew testing them would take time, and having DNA from a blood sample didn't mean authorities would necessarily be able to match it to anyone. So Pickett called his investigative team together. He said he knew it was late, but he wanted to work fast and he wanted to work smart. He sent members of the team out in the middle of the night to see if they could track down and interview Crystal's neighbors, friends, and family. And within a couple of hours, Pickett got news that set the investigation in motion. One of Crystal's friends had told police that 2 weeks earlier, Crystal's fiancé, Dennis, had shown up to Crystal's house waving a knife around and threatening to kill her. At 4 a.m., 2.5 hours after police arrived at Crystal's house, Detective Pickett and 3 other officers knocked on the door of Dennis's parents' house where Dennis was staying. It took a few minutes, but Dennis finally answered and let the police inside. Pickett asked Dennis if he had seen Crystal that night, and then Dennis did something that kind of stunned all of the officers. Instead of answering the question, Dennis started pacing the room, and he turned to the cops and asked, "Is Crystal dead?" And as soon as that happened, the police decided they really needed to bring Dennis in right away for questioning. A little later that morning, Dennis sat across from Pickett and the other members of the investigative team in a small, cramped police interrogation room. Pickett didn't waste any time with pleasantries. He told Dennis that in the few hours since they had found Crystal's body, they had already learned that she and Dennis had a pretty rough relationship and that Dennis was known to have a temper and to get aggressive. Dennis admitted that things were bad between him and Crystal, but that didn't mean he was a killer. He said a lot of couples yell and scream at each other when they argue. Then, in a calm voice, Pickett asked if Dennis was at all responsible for Crystal's death, and Dennis said no. But then, Dennis started shaking, almost like he was having convulsions. Every cop in the room had seen suspects get nervous and have trouble staying still during interrogations, but none of them had seen anything like this before. They got Dennis calmed down and made sure he was physically okay. Then they asked him if he'd be willing to submit samples for DNA testing. Then Dennis steadied himself and said he would. After hours with the police, Dennis left the station, and Pickett thought there was a good chance that once the test results came in, Dennis's DNA would match the DNA from the drop of blood the forensics team had taken from Crystal's leg and from other similar drops they had found in the kitchen. So Pickett thought there was a pretty good chance he'd be able to close this case quickly. On the afternoon of May 12th, so a few hours after police had questioned Dennis, Detective Pickett and another officer walked into a small bedroom inside of Sarah's grandmother's house, so Crystal's mother's house. There, they saw Crystal's 12-year-old daughter, Sarah, sitting almost motionless on the bed, staring at the sunlight that was coming in through the window. After Sarah had been released from the hospital, she had been sent to stay with her grandmother. Pickett approached Sarah and introduced himself. Then, Pickett very calmly and gently asked Sarah to please tell them what had happened at her house the night before. Sarah took a deep breath and then told the officers that she had been asleep and then heard her mom screaming in the other room. She said she had stayed in her own room until everything went quiet. Then she told the officers about how she found her mom in the kitchen, how she tried to call the police, and then how she ended up running outside and all the way into town to get help. Pickett smiled at Sarah and then asked her if she had maybe caught a glimpse of the person who was with her mother, or if maybe she had recognized this person's voice. Sarah stared at Pickett. She didn't like how he was talking to her, like she was just a little kid. Sarah said she didn't see the other person because she stayed in her room the whole time, and all she had heard was shouting, so she couldn't make out the other person's voice. Pickett smiled again, then he asked her if she liked her mother's boyfriend, Dennis, and was it maybe possible that Sarah knew Dennis had been in their house, but she just didn't want to say that because she wanted to protect him. Sarah glared at Pickett. She was young, but she was smart and observant, and she thought the police wanted her to be an eyewitness who had seen the man who they already believed had killed her mom. But Sarah said she really didn't know who else had been in the house. Pickett thanked Sarah for talking to them, and he and the other officer walked out of the room and headed outside. Pickett did believe Dennis was the most likely culprit, but police would have to wait weeks on DNA test results, and Pickett had no intention of excluding any other leads that might come up between now and those results coming in. Later that day, the investigative team met with more of Crystal's friends and coworkers, and most of them pointed the finger at Dennis too. They knew about his and Crystal's history, and they knew about Dennis's temper. But a few of her friends said there was another man police should look into, Crystal's ex-husband and Sarah's father, Tom Perry. So Pickett began digging into Tom's background right away. He discovered that Crystal had been after Tom to pay the monthly child support that he owed her because he was not giving her the money that the court had ordered him to pay after he and Crystal got divorced. Pickett figured if Crystal had been after Tom for money, that might have been a motive for Tom to attack her. But as Pickett learned about Tom, he started to think there might actually be an even more likely suspect than him. Because Pickett found out that Crystal had once filed a restraining order against one of Tom's girlfriends, Joanne Stager. And after speaking to one of Crystal's friends, Pickett learned that in the past few weeks, Joanne had been harassing Crystal. And it turned out that those angry, disturbing phone calls Crystal had been getting at the house were not coming from Dennis like Sarah thought. They had been coming from Joanne, and she had been threatening Crystal. 2 days after Crystal's murder, Detective Pickett and members of his team sat in the living room across from Crystal's ex-husband Tom and his girlfriend Joanne at the house the couple shared. The investigative team still considered Crystal's boyfriend Dennis their primary suspect, but with new information about Tom, and especially about his girlfriend Joanne, they had another promising lead. Pickett looked at the couple sitting on the couch. They were both in their 30s, and they were both tall and had dark hair. And Joanne couldn't seem to stay still for more than a few seconds at a time. Pickett asked Tom about his relationship with Crystal, and when he did, Pickett immediately saw a look of anger come across Joanne's face. But Tom would answer, and he would say that he barely ever talked to Crystal anymore, and he said he totally regretted this, but he didn't really play any meaningful role in his daughter, Sarah's, life. After that, Pickett turned to Joanne and asked her about the restraining order Crystal had filed against her. Joanne kind of laughed, and then she told Pickett a story like she was performing on a stage. She said a couple years earlier, she had seen Crystal's red hair from across the dance floor at a club, and she had seen men watching Crystal from all over the place like they always did. But she wasn't angry about that. She was angry because she believed Crystal still had a thing for Tom, and she was tired of Crystal calling the house. So she had marched across the dance floor and confronted Crystal about it. She said Crystal had gotten angry and looked like she was about to start a fight, and so preemptively, Joanne punched her in the face. As Pickett listened to this story, he had trouble believing that anybody other than Joanne had been the cause of that fight. After she was done, Pickett asked her about the angry phone calls, and Joanne said she was just telling Crystal to back off and to leave Tom alone. But Joanne said she would never kill anyone. Finally, Pickett asked where each of them had been at the time of Crystal's murder, and they said they had been together at the house. Pickett knew they could be telling the truth, but each of them being the other's alibi wasn't nearly enough for Pickett to accept their story. So he asked if they would submit DNA samples for testing. Tom and Joanne looked at each other, and then they both looked back at Pickett and said they would be willing to do that. Later that day, Pickett returned to the station. As he looked over his notes from the interviews police had already conducted, he still thought Dennis made the most sense as the suspect. But after meeting with Tom and Joanne, he definitely thought there were other viable suspects. Then, on May 15th, 3 days after Crystal's murder, her friends and family held a small funeral service at a church before Crystal was to be cremated. Sarah stood in the church quietly, and she listened to friends and family talk about her mother and about how much her mom had loved her. And then at some point, Sarah's mother's siblings got up and they said they would get justice for Crystal, whatever it took. And then after the funeral, members of the investigative team heard from one of Crystal's friends that Joanne had been seen popping open champagne and toasting to Crystal's death. And after that, at least some members of the state police started to believe Joanne was just as likely to have killed Crystal as Dennis. In early summer of 1994, weeks after Crystal's murder, results from DNA testing conducted during the investigation started to trickle in, and those results left Detective Pickett and the investigative team in complete shock. The DNA sample from the drop of blood taken from Crystal's leg and other samples taken from her body and around the crime scene did not match the DNA samples provided by Dennis, Tom, or Joanne. Investigators had become so convinced that one of those three people had killed Crystal that they had trouble accepting these DNA results. So they asked for the lab to run the tests again. But when they did, the results were the same. There was no match to any of the main suspects in the case. After that, the authorities ran the DNA test results through something called CODIS, which is a massive FBI database with DNA results from convicted offenders of violent crimes from across the country. And in 1994, the FBI had just started using CODIS to assist police investigations nationwide. So Pickett had high hopes that this new technology would help keep his investigation on track. But the DNA samples taken from Crystal and her house did not match anyone in this massive FBI database. So all of a sudden, this case that had three strong suspects who all had clear motives completely fell apart, and Pickett and his team found themselves having to start all over. But after reassessing the crime scene and conducting a new round of interviews, all of the investigators' theories just felt like pure conjecture. Police followed leads that could possibly connect Crystal's murder to a serial killer who had been caught in the region, but DNA evidence also quickly ruled that out as well. Then, investigators started to look at the possibility that Crystal's murder could have been a robbery gone wrong. Maybe some drug user had broken into her house to steal valuables, to sell for drug money, and then of course something had gone wrong and Crystal had wound up dead. After all, drugs were a real issue in Bridgeton, Maine. But a drug addict breaking in, or any robber for that matter, didn't really make sense to Pickett. He and members of the forensics team had always believed the level of violence that had taken place in Crystal's murder indicated it must have been a crime of passion, not some random robbery that just got interrupted. So Pickett soon came to terms with the fact that his investigation had almost nothing to go on. And by the summer of 1995, a year after Crystal's murder, her case was just not a top priority anymore, and it started to go cold. And in May of 1996, 2 years after Crystal's murder, there was still no new information coming in. Crystal's siblings posted a $10,000 reward for anyone who could provide information that would lead to the arrest of the person who had killed their sister, but none of the people who then came forward were able to provide any useful evidence. So another year went by with almost nothing new on the case. Then, not long after that, Detective Pickett retired from the Maine State Police, and people in Bridgeton figured they would never know who had killed Crystal. By that time, Sarah had moved to Texas to live with family members there, and she was doing her best to try to live her life. She thought about her mother constantly, but she had started to distance herself from her friends and family in Maine, as well as the police she had met during the investigation. Years went by without Sarah ever hearing anything new about her mother's murder case, and she grew up, graduated high school, went to college, and then got a job. The little 12-year-old girl who had found her mother murdered in the kitchen and who had run across town in the rain in the middle of the night to get help had now become an adult. And like almost everybody else, Sarah had eventually given up on ever knowing who had killed her mom. In April of 2006, almost 12 years after Crystal's murder, Detective Walter Gerzib of the Maine State Police was sitting in his office. Gerzib had been involved in the investigation into Crystal's murder when he was a young officer, and after Pickett retired, Gerzib had moved up the ranks, and he had remained one of the few investigators who continued to try to find new leads in Crystal's murder case. But that case had remained cold for over a decade, so Gerzib was not hopeful that he or anyone else would ever solve it. Gerzib's phone rang at his desk, so he answered it, and an FBI agent introduced themselves on the other line. And after the two had talked for a few minutes, Gerzib couldn't believe what he was hearing. The FBI agent told him a kidnapper had been caught and convicted in Maine. That kidnapper had submitted a DNA sample, and that sample had been run through the FBI database, and it had matched the blood samples that had been found on Crystal and in her house 12 years earlier. Gerzib hung up the phone in total shock. Soon after the call, Gerzib, other members of the Maine State Police, and FBI agents met with this kidnapper who was in custody. And after that meeting, Gerzib would make a phone call he had been waiting to make for years. He would call Crystal's daughter, Sarah, who was 24 years old at the time, and he would tell her that the police finally knew who had killed her mother. Based on the meeting with the convicted kidnapper, interviews conducted during the investigation, and evidence and DNA samples collected from the crime scene, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened the night somebody murdered Crystal Perry on May 12, 1994. A little before 1 a.m., the killer listened to the sound of their windshield wipers going back and forth while they drove in the rain down a tree-lined road towards Crystal's house. The killer felt their hands tingling. They figured that feeling was the feeling of anticipation because they'd finally gotten up the guts to do something they had wanted to do for a long time. The killer pulled off the road into Crystal's driveway and parked their car behind hers. They turned off the engine, took the keys out of the ignition, and then sat there just listening to the rain and staring at the house for a couple of minutes. Then the killer got out of the car, walked up the driveway, and knocked on the front door. Crystal opened the door just enough to see who was there, and then moments later, she smiled and let the killer in. The killer walked into the house and made their way towards the kitchen, with Crystal following a couple of feet behind. Once the killer reached the kitchen, they stopped, turned around, and looked Crystal in the eye. The killer took a breath and then walked right up to Crystal and put their arms on her arms and then moved in to give her a kiss. But Crystal immediately pushed the killer off and told them to get out of the house. Without thinking, the killer lunged at Crystal, grabbed her, and pulled her onto the ground. Crystal kicked and thrashed, but she could not get free. And so with Crystal pinned down, the killer began to sexually assault her. After it was over, the killer got up off the floor and quickly walked over to a drawer, opened it up, and pulled out a sharp kitchen knife. Crystal saw it and screamed "no" over and over and over again, pulling herself up off the floor and running for the phone. Crystal managed to grab it, but the killer had wheeled around by this point and wrapped their arms around her, and the phone fell to the floor. The killer then threw Crystal back on the floor and pinned her to the ground again. Then the killer raised the knife, and immediately Crystal threw her fists and kicked wildly at the killer, and the killer suddenly felt the knife slice into their own hand, and they saw blood dripping from it. But the killer kept Crystal pinned to the ground, they raised the knife and slammed it into her chest. After that, Crystal stopped fighting, and her body went limp. But the killer just kept on raising that knife and dropping it over and over and over again. In total, the killer would stab Crystal over 50 times. Finally, the killer stopped stabbing and looked around the room. There was blood everywhere, and their boots had left bloody prints on the floor. And the blood from the cut on the killer's hand kept dripping on Crystal's leg. The killer stood up, pocketed the knife, and walked over to the kitchen counter. They grabbed paper towels, knelt down, and started wiping away some of the blood on the floor. But there was just too much, and they had already been in the house for so long, so the killer just held on to the bloody paper towels. They walked back through the house, went outside, and got into their car. They threw the car in reverse, pulled out onto the road, and drove not far down the road to where they lived in town. Michael Hutchinson, the young man with the drug problem who walked around town all the time high on cocaine, who had gone to high school with Dennis, had murdered Crystal. Michael had never even come up in the investigation because there was really no connection between him and Crystal. It turned out that when Michael came to Crystal's house on the night of the murder, police believe he asked to use her phone because he said he was having car trouble. And Crystal most likely let Michael in because she recognized him as a local and because she was just a nice person. But some members of the police believe Michael was a bit more calculated, that he had probably been one of those men who checked out Crystal from a distance when she was in town or at a bar or on a dance floor. And Michael had wanted her. And so he had shown up to her house, possibly under the influence of alcohol and drugs, and tried to get her to sleep with him. And when Crystal rejected him, Michael went into a blind rage, and he sexually assaulted her and ultimately killed her. And Michael had basically gotten away with it and never even been suspected for years. But then Michael got busted for something totally separate, kidnapping, and he submitted DNA samples, and the FBI database got a hit. Michael's new DNA samples matched the passive blood drops taken from Crystal's leg and from her house. Further tests also showed that Michael's semen matched the semen samples taken from Crystal's body. And finally, when investigators met with Michael, they saw a large scar on his hand from a cut that matched the type of knife that was used to kill Crystal. Michael was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. As of 2023, Sarah, Crystal's daughter, is a very successful author. She wrote a memoir about her life with her mother before the murder and her life after the murder. The book's dedication page simply reads, "For her." By 1993, Ludmila Korovina, who was a 41-year-old Russian hiking instructor, came under fairly intense criticism from her colleagues for being too survivalist with her students. They thought she was a little bit too aggressive with how she pushed her students, putting them in unnecessarily risky situations out in the wild where they weren't really ready for it, and at any point, she might push them too far and wind up getting someone killed. Her students, however, absolutely adored her. They said on the mountains, she was fearless and in tune with nature, and they felt very safe around her. And then at camp, she was very motherly and tender and always took the time to make sure all of her students were taken care of well before she was. Former students have said the mentorship they received from Ludmila went well beyond just hiking instruction. They said she taught a mindset that they carried with them into adulthood, and they pointed to as one of the main reasons they were successful later in life. In the summer of 1993, Ludmila was scheduled to lead an expedition up to the Hamar Daban Ridge, which is in eastern Siberia, and it's one of the oldest mountains on the planet. With her on this expedition would be 6 fairly experienced hiking students that ranged in ages from 15 to 24 years old. One of those 6 students was a 23-year-old young man named Sasha, who, although he was not Ludmila's biological son, she called him her son because she had raised him ever since he was a young child, and he looked at Ludmila as his mother. Sasha also happened to be the most physically fit and competent of all 6 hiking students, and he would function more like an assistant to Ludmila on this particular hike rather than a pupil. The other 5 students were 24-year-old Tatiana, 19-year-old Dennis, 16-year-old Victoria, 15-year-old Timur, and 17-year-old Valentina, who she is the only reason we know anything about the horrible things that happened to this group up on Hamar Daban Ridge. On August 1st, 1993, Ludmila and her hiking group boarded a Trans-Siberian railway car in Kazakhstan, and later that day they arrived in a town called Marino, which is on the eastern side of Siberia on the southern end, and it butts up against the base of the Hamar Daban mountain range. The Hamar Daban mountain was not considered a very dangerous hike to make. It was relatively small. It was just under 2,400 meters in elevation, and in the summertime, you'd have scores of recreational hikers all over this mountain range. Plus, the weather forecast for Ludmila and her group's multi-day hike in that mountain range was going to be incredibly favorable. It was going to be warm, clear, nice summer weather. Ludmila had charted a course that began just outside of the town of Marino, which is the town they were staying in that first night. They were going to start next to Lake Baikal, which is the deepest lake in Russia. From the lake, they were going to move north and inland over this stretch that was totally barren. There was no trees, it was just rocks and grass before ultimately reaching the Hamar Daban Ridge, which was their destination. And at that point, there would be shelter and firewood, and they could take a break before ultimately descending. And so in total, from the lake all the way to Hamar Daban Ridge was approximately 50 miles. Ludmila's group would not be the only group making this particular movement towards Hamar Daban Ridge. They'd be taking their own path, but there'd be 2 other groups that were on similar courses, basically parallel to them, making their way up to the ridge. And one of those groups was actually led by Ludmila's 16-year-old biological daughter, and they had actually made plans to meet up on one of the last days of this multi-day hike. As they were making their descent, there was a forest they were going to meet up in. So Ludmila and her 6 students stayed the night in Marino, and the next morning they got up early and made their way over to Lake Baikal. The weather's beautiful, they're excited to start their journey, and they take off. And everything was going great until the late afternoon. It would turn out the weather forecasters were just completely wrong, and as soon as the group climbed above the tree line, the temperatures plummeted and it started raining and snowing on them. It was just absolutely miserable. This treacherous weather would persist over the next few days, and it really started to destroy the morale in the group. But Ludmila, she was a pro, and she had hiked in far worse conditions than this, and so she made a point of telling the group that this stuff happens. Bad weather happens. We are prepared. We are trained. We're going to be fine. You need to have a positive attitude about this. We need to just keep pushing forward and not play victim here. And that was enough to inspire the group to just keep on going. You know, they believed in Ludmila, and she's telling them to keep going, so they kept going. By the evening of August 4th, so this is 3 full days of hiking later, they were only about 30 minutes away from the summit. They have now reached the point where they are in the open section of the mountain where there is no reprieve from the wind or the rain or the snow. There's no trees to block anything. And so it's just an absolute abomination trying to climb this last stretch. Every step is like an eternity as the wind just cuts through their clothes and they're soaking wet and miserable. Ludmila's students were not about to ask for a break. They knew how she operated. She was someone that really believed in pushing through your own pain and fatigue and misery, and she always led by example, and they saw her, right out in front leading the charge up towards the Hamar Daban Ridge. And so they were very surprised when she stopped and she turned around and told them, "We're taking a break. And in fact, we're actually going to camp out for the night right where we are right here." No one knows why Ludmila made this decision. On the one hand, it does make sense to take a break and say, you know what, we'll reach the summit tomorrow. We've had a really hard couple of days here with the bad weather. We'll make camp and we'll get some rest and we'll hit the summit tomorrow. That makes sense. But where she elected to make camp does not make sense. She had them stop right smack dab in the middle of this totally open section of the mountain where there are no trees, there's no objects to protect them from the horrible wind and snow and ice and rain that's just going to be pelting them all night. And so some people have speculated that when she looked at her crew of hikers, they were so badly beaten down and tired and miserable that she knew she could not ask them to go any further. And so that was why she said, let's just make camp here, we'll make do. Others have said her map may not have been very accurate. And so she didn't know how close she was to the summit, where at the summit there was literally a shelter that had firewood and a place for you to rest. Maybe she didn't know she was so close. Perhaps she thought she was much farther away and this is the best we can do. But what the inaccurate map theory does not account for is Ludmila would have known there is a forest about 2.5 miles down the mountain, because the whole time they've been on this hike, they've tried to stay up above the tree line as they make this final approach up to the ridge. And so she would have known there's a forest right down there. And if I wanted to, I could go down there and seek shelter in the trees. And so for whatever reason, she decided that we can't go down to the forest, we got to stay here. And so perhaps that lends more credibility to the idea that the group was far more beaten down than maybe we even realize. And she thought they can't make the 2.5 mile journey. We're going to have to just make camp here and make do. But regardless of her reasoning, they did make camp right in the middle of this open section. They set up 2 wet, crappy tents, and they used their little kerosene stoves to make a tiny meal. And then they all crammed inside of these 2 tents and huddled as the wind howled outside. That night, the storm got much worse. The wind picked up, and again, they're totally exposed on this open section of the mountain, and so they're just getting destroyed by this wind. And at about 2 a.m., the wind actually broke the ropes that were holding the tents down, and they had to go outside and retie them, and they were able to do that. And then a couple hours later, at about 4 a.m., the wind actually lifted up the section of the tent that was facing where the wind was blowing, and it pulled the tent up in such a way that water rushed into the tent and soaked their sleeping bags. And they were able to go outside, and they put the stakes back down on the ground, but they were sleeping in wet sleeping bags in the middle of this mountain in the middle of a storm. So this is getting quite dangerous at this point. But they were able to eventually fall asleep, and at about 10 a.m. the next morning, Ludmila gets up and looks outside, and she can see that everything is frozen, that it's snowed and the temperatures have dropped again, and everything is just snow and ice. And she knows that, we're actually reaching very dangerous hypothermia territory, and if we don't warm up soon, this could be life-threatening. And so she woke everybody up and she said, we need to go down into that forest and we need to start a fire as soon as possible. And so everybody said, all right, they got up, they started packing up their things, rolled up their tents, and they began walking down the mountain in a line. Although this was not intended, when Ludmila had said, we will reach the summit tomorrow, that had delayed their schedule. And it meant they were not going to be able to meet up with her daughter the next day. But now in the morning, when they're deciding basically to abandon the summit and turn around and head down again, they were now back on schedule to meet up with her daughter down in the forest. However, her daughter said she was at the rendezvous point in the forest, and Ludmila and the 6 other hikers never showed. 4 days later, on August 9th, a group of Ukrainian kayakers were making their way down this river in southern Siberia, and they were passing by the Hamar-Daban mountain range. And so as they're kind of slowly moving their way down, it's this beautiful morning, and they're looking up at the mountains all around them. The leader of this group happens to see something move on his left side. There's a forest right up against the left side of this river, and he turns his head, and he has to do a double take because there is this girl who's standing there at the edge of the forest looking out at them totally expressionless, and she's covered in blood. And she's not doing anything. She's just standing there. And at first, he actually thought, we need to leave. His first thought was, we need to just get away from this person. There's something wrong with this person. But very quickly, the group realized, we cannot abandon this girl. This is a young girl who should not be out here. I don't know what she's doing out here. And so they turned around and they went on shore and they yelled to her. They said, are you okay? And she just stood there not reacting. And they tried a couple more times to say, hey, we're not going to hurt you. We just want to know what's going on. And she didn't say a word. She just stood there in shock. She looked very scared. They finally got up right next to her and they asked her, what are you so scared of? Where are you coming from? And they just could not get her to speak. But they're up close looking at her and, she's got blood all over her. She looks dirty. She looks like she might be sick. And so they decide that, this girl needs help, and they had blankets. And so they threw blankets over her. They put her in one of the kayaks and they brought her back to town. Once in town, the Ukrainian kayakers went and got authorities and said, hey, we found this girl. She was covered in blood walking out of the forest. We have no idea what's going on with her. And so authorities came over to speak to her. And although she barely spoke, she would finally say that she was 17 years old. Her name was Valentina Yotachenko, and that she had been a part of a 7-person hiking group up along the Hamar-Daban Ridge. And then she paused and they said, well, where's your hiking group? How did you get separated? This is what she told them. Back on the morning of August 5th, so this would have been the morning after that terrible night's sleep on the mountain where the tent ropes are breaking and their sleeping bags are getting soaking wet. Well, Valentina wakes up and she looks outside of the tent and she sees Ludmila, and she's standing there with her hands on her hips and she's looking around. She looks very concerned.
Valentina goes out there, and Ludmila turns to her and says, we need to leave. We need to go down to the forest, and we need to make a fire. Can you help me wake everybody up and start having them pack up their stuff so we can get moving? So Valentina goes in, she starts waking people up, and everybody very quickly packs up the tent, packs up their things, and they're in a line, and they start walking down the mountain. They had only made it about 10 meters into their descent when Sasha, the 23-year-old young man that Ludmila considered her son, he just suddenly falls. And the other hikers, Valentina included, run over and they help get him up again, and he looks kind of shaken. He takes a couple more steps and he falls again. And this time, when Valentina goes over to try to help him up with the others, they see his eyes are wide and he looks like he's really terrified, and then blood starts rushing out of his nose and his ears and his mouth, and then he just suddenly dies. And Ludmila runs over and she grabs him and she's panicking and she's trying to feel for a pulse and she's checking for his heart, and then she screams out in pain and anguish and she yells, he's dead. The other hikers can't believe this is happening. They can't even process that someone, any of them, had died, let alone it be Sasha, the most physically fit and healthy one of all of them, including up until a few minutes ago. He wasn't showing any signs or symptoms that something was wrong. He was perfectly fine. What's going on? Ludmila was in shock. She's on the ground and she's holding on to Sasha, and she's telling the group that she's not going anywhere. She's staying with Sasha. And Valentina would say the group is just falling apart at this point. You have some of them that are crying, others who are just standing there looking around like, what's happening to us right now? And at some point, Ludmila collects herself and she says to the group, go down to the forest. Go down to the forest and start a fire. And Valentina said they didn't want to leave her and they were pleading with her to let them stay. And she said, no, go down to the forest and start a fire. And finally, Valentina said the group would. They'd get together and they'd turn around, and not really knowing what was going to happen next, they just begin walking down this mountain, and they only get a few steps before they hear Ludmila yell out to come back. She's saying, I can't move. And they turn around, and Valentina was towards the front of the returning group as they're going back up the mountain, back to Ludmila. And she's now bleeding out of her nose and her ears and her mouth. She's heaving like something's going on inside of her, and then all of a sudden she keels over on top of Sasha. And she dies right in front of them. And now the group is in hysterics. And Valentina's in the front. And she can't see anybody else. And then she turns around and she can't believe what she's seeing to her side. Now everybody else is bleeding from their nose and their ears and their mouth. And some of them are frothing from the mouth. Valentina reached for her mouth and her ears and her nose to look for blood, and there wasn't any. And then she turned and she saw 16-year-old Victoria and 24-year-old Tatiana suddenly fall to the ground, just like Sasha had, except they weren't just laying there. They began rolling around and ripping their clothes off and clutching at their throats, and they're frothing at the mouth. And so Valentina reaches down to try to help Victoria, the 16-year-old, and Victoria bites her on the hand and she pulls her hand back. And then Victoria curls into a ball and then goes still. And then Tatiana begins hitting her head on a rock over and over and over again until she goes still. At this point, Valentina is in pure survival mode, and so she looks at the other two, which was 15-year-old Timur and 19-year-old Dennis. Everybody else is down on the ground at this point. And she sees Dennis is moving behind a rock, and he looks like he's not acting as erratic as everybody else. And so she starts making her way over to Dennis to see if he's going to be okay. And on the way, she sees 15-year-old Timur fall to the ground, and he's suddenly lying there still. And so she believes he's dead too. She gets over to Dennis, and he's bleeding profusely from all of his orifices in his head, but he's talking to her, and he's saying, okay, you need to go back to your bag, get out whatever you can that is essential, ditch the rest, and run down to the forest, and I'll meet you down there. And so Valentina says, okay, she makes her way up to her bag, she gets her sleeping bag and a couple other small items, and when she turns around to go back to Dennis, she sees that he's now slouched over his backpack, and now the blood is just pouring out of his head, and she can tell that almost certainly he's dead as well. And so not only is she all alone, she's now totally traumatized and believes whatever has happened to them is going to happen to her. And so she runs down the mountain and she goes into the forest and she gets underneath this rock overhang. She puts her sleeping bag down, she crawls inside, and she drifts in and out of consciousness for the rest of the day. And then that night, she's still laying there and the storm picked up dramatically, and she could hear all night these huge trees all over the mountain falling and slamming all around her. And so she's thinking, if I don't die from whatever killed my friends, I'm going to get hit by one of these trees. But she manages to get through the night. The next morning, the storm had cleared, and so Valentina gets up, and she's thinking to herself, maybe by some miracle, one of them is still alive. And so she climbs back up the mountain to where they were, and she finds all of them still laying exactly where they were when she left them, all motionless, all deceased. And so she decides to go one by one and close each of their eyelids. And then she says her goodbye. And then she turns and kind of wanders back into the forest, where she would stay for the next 4 days, desperately walking around, hoping to be rescued at some point, the whole time just expecting to die, either from exposure, from an animal attack, from whatever killed my friends. Eventually, she does hear voices, and she starts making her way towards where they're coming from. And that's when she gets to the river, and she sees the Ukrainian kayakers, who ultimately pick her up and bring her back to town. After authorities heard Valentina's story and realized there were other hikers out there, they launched a search party, and it would take them a month to locate them. Their bodies were contorted and their faces were locked in these grimaces that looked like they were in absolute terror and agony right as they died. In addition to missing most of their clothing and their shoes, they were also all missing their eyeballs. The autopsies were only able to conclude that hypothermia contributed to their death, although it wasn't the only factor, as well as a protein deficiency, despite the fact that they had all eaten well over the course of their trip, and that all of their lungs were very bruised, but they didn't know what that was from. But nothing the autopsy concluded could reconcile what Valentina said she saw happen, which was a sudden, violent death of 6 healthy people with no signs and symptoms leading up. Suddenly, they are bleeding out of every orifice and they're falling to the ground, tearing their clothes off, grabbing at their throats, frothing at the mouth, and then dying. And whatever happened to them, why didn't it happen to Valentina? To this day, we don't really have a good answer why that happened, and the case is closed. It was ruled they mostly died of hypothermia and it was an accident, and that's that. But this isn't the first time something like this has happened in Russia. In 1959, 9 very experienced Russian hikers set off on a 16-day expedition into the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union, and about 10 days into their hike, they reached a part where they needed to crest over this mountain before some bad weather rolled in. And they started moving up this mountain, which would be renamed the Dyatlov Pass after the leader of this group. His name is Dyatlov. They started making their way up the Dyatlov Pass, and they were going too slowly, and the weather was coming in too quickly. And so they had to make a critical decision. Stay put, but be in this totally exposed, open mountain face, much like the Hamar Daban situation where they were up on that open mountain face. Either hunker down there and get ruined by weather, and the weather was a lot worse for the Dyatlov Pass group. It was, sub-zero temperatures and just snowing ruthlessly. Or they could go down and give up ground and go down to the forest at the base of this mountain where you'd be sheltered from the storm with some trees. And so these hikers, who might be a little bit overconfident in their ability, decide to stick it out right on this mountain face. And over the course of that night, at some point, they cut open their tent with a knife from the inside and ran out into sub-zero temperatures, most of them not wearing shoes, not wearing jackets, not wearing pants. They're basically in underwear. And they calmly walked down the mountain all the way down to the forest. And once they got down there, 2 of them tried to desperately climb this big tree where there wasn't any low-hanging branches. And so they couldn't climb up it. We don't know what they were trying to climb up it for, but they ended up building this little tiny fire that could not have provided very much warmth at all. And they were found deceased lying around this fire. 7 other hikers were found in 2 different areas. One that appeared to go down to that tree where those 2 were, but then doubled back and tried to get up to the campsite, but didn't make it and fell to the ground and died there. The other group was not found for a couple of weeks later. They were found at the mouth of this river. They were inside of this den, and they were wearing the clothes of the other hikers that were deceased. And the clothes they had on had traces of radiation on them. And the ones that were in the den had these devastating chest and skull injuries, and one of them was missing their eyeballs. And the official statement by the Soviet Union was they died from an unknown compelling force, which is a really mysterious way to describe how someone might die. This case was actually reinvestigated in 2020, and the new cause of death is death by avalanche, except loads of people disagree with that. In fact, experts have gone out to where this happened, and they say not only was there no avalanche, there's never been an avalanche in this area. There's literally never been one. So what do you think? Is there a connection between Hamar Daban and the Dyatlov Pass incident? Is there a cover-up in both cases where something far more sinister has happened to both groups that we don't know about? Or are they unrelated, and these are just both examples of Mother Nature being far more powerful than we even realize?
The next and final story of today's episode is a MrBallen fan favorite. It's called Bell's Canyon. In 2016, a 25-year-old Wall Street banker named Matt was camping near Mount Rainier in Washington state. His job was so hectic that in the rare times he got a chance to, he would disappear into the wilderness for a few days to clear his head. Despite living in one of the biggest cities in the world, Matt was actually a very competent outdoorsman, and so for this trip, he decided he would stay way off any trail deep in the backcountry in random locations. On the first night, he found a nice clearing in the trees, and so he set up his campsite there. He ate some food over his fire, he pitched his tent, climbed inside, and within a few minutes, he was fast asleep. Several hours later, Matt woke up to some strange sounds coming from outside of his tent. It sounded like a couple of animals or maybe one animal moving around right outside. And so after a while of just hearing this constant sound, he rolled over and he barely unzipped his tent flap just to look out and see if he could see whatever animal it was. And what he saw shocked him. There was a man sitting in front of his fire pit. There was no fire in his fire pit. And the guy was just sitting there with his hands on his knees, looking straight down. And periodically he would just kick his feet in the ashes of the fire pit. And Matt didn't even know what to do, so he's just looking at him through this little tiny gap in his tent. And this man all of a sudden looks up directly at Matt and makes eye contact with him. And the guy's eyes go wide, and he stands up, turns around, and runs away from Matt's campsite. Matt has no idea how to react to this, and so he just quickly unzips his tent, jumps outside, and shines his light into the forest looking for this guy. He's thinking to himself, who is this guy? I am in the middle of nowhere in the backcountry of Washington state. How long was he sitting outside there for? What does he want? And so as Matt is trying to make sense of this totally weird thing, he's thinking, okay, I'm going to look out and I'm going to see his flashlight somewhere, or I'm going to see his campsite. Maybe he's set up nearby and he's looking around into the total darkness. He's looking through all the trees, any light source anywhere out there he would see. And there's not one. There's no fire. There's no flashlight. There is nothing. And so eventually Matt goes back inside of his tent. He zips it up and he's just left kind of dumbfounded. He can't understand how some person was just sitting outside of his tent for no apparent reason and then vanished into the forest without even turning on a flashlight. And so after a very restless night, finally the sun came up again and Matt was very relieved. He stepped outside, and after a little bit of time now from this strange incident, Matt started to tell himself that all that was is some guy happened to set up his campsite nearby. It is possible, albeit rare because we're in the backcountry, and maybe he was just intoxicated and he wandered over here and, stranger things have happened, so that's probably all it was. And so Matt felt like there was nothing to worry about. He packed up his campsite and he began hiking into the forest. Matt didn't have a planned route. Instead, he had a map and a compass, and he began just kind of wandering in the forest, kind of exploring wherever he wanted to go. And over the next 2 days, he covered at least 10, maybe 15 miles in kind of random zigzag directions. He found a nice clearing and he set up another campsite. That night, he set up a fire and he was eating some food near his fire. And then as he's sitting there, he hears rustling coming from behind him. And he's pretty sure it's an animal, so he turns around and he doesn't see anything. And he goes back to eating his food. And then a little while later, he hears some more rustling behind him. And this time, he can't really just write it off. Clearly, there is something behind him that's moving around. And so he stood up, turned around, and remained motionless and just listened, expecting to see maybe a deer come out of the woods. But instead, he hears a man's voice come out of the darkness that says,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
And Matt's heart starts racing. He knows that even though he can't see him, it has to be the same guy he saw 2 days ago. Because they are in the middle of nowhere. He hasn't seen any other hikers or campers or anyone. And clearly this guy has the ability to sneak up on him. And so he's thinking, what does this guy want? I just spent the past 2 days hiking in random directions for 15 miles, and he must have followed me. And so Matt, not knowing what else to do, just says, I don't know where Bell's Canyon is. And then there's silence. And Matt, one part of him is thinking, I hope this guy does not come into the light. I hope he just goes away. The other part of him is thinking, well, maybe this is a different person that is lost and they're looking for this place called Bell's Canyon and they'll come into the light. It'll be a big relief. I'll send them on their merry way and everything will be fine. But as Matt is having this wishful thinking, the voice from the shadows does not come any closer, but instead asks the same question a bit more forcefully this time.
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
This time, Matt did not respond. Now he was scared. This is not some friendly hiker looking for directions. There's something wrong. And so Matt, knowing he's all alone out here, he knew he had to do something to try to take control of this situation. And so he took a deep breath, he reached down and grabbed his flashlight, and in one swift motion, he lifted his light up and shined it in the direction of this guy's voice. And what he saw was this guy from 2 days ago looking out from behind a tree right in Matt's direction. He was hiding from him. And when the light hit him, the man barked at Matt to aim it away. And Matt kind of instinctively lowered his light, but now he was too scared to raise it again, and now he knows it's the same guy. This guy has been following me for 2 days. And so for several minutes, Matt just stood there absolutely terrified, and this guy, he just stayed out there. Matt didn't hear a move. It was just a complete standstill. And then the silence was broken yet again by this voice, except somehow he had moved even closer to Matt. And when he came through asking the same question,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
His voice was so close to Matt that Matt got scared and raised his light up, and the man was standing just a few feet away from him. And this time, the man's eyes got wide like they did the first time they saw Matt, and he turned around and he ran into the forest again. Matt, not knowing any better, just began running after him, but he only ran for about 30 seconds before he realized the terrain out here is so rough. He's gonna fall, get hurt, he's gonna get lost, and this guy's already long gone. He somehow managed to run immediately so far away, and so Matt just goes back to his campsite, and he's thinking to himself, what do I do? I have no cell phone service. I'm at least 3 days away from my car, and I'm in the middle of nowhere. No one even knows where I am because I didn't chart a course. I didn't tell anyone where I was going to be. And so Matt just grabbed his knife and stood in the middle of the campsite, and for hours and hours, he just kept looking around, expecting this guy to just show up again or start speaking to him from somewhere out in the darkness. It was absolutely horrifying. Finally, by about 3 a.m, Matt was so tired that he had to go to sleep. He hadn't heard this guy again. He didn't see him again. And he figured, I need a little bit of sleep because tomorrow he's going to pack up his campsite and begin this epic journey back to his car. And so he climbed in his tent and he had a very restless next couple of hours. When the sun came up, Matt jumped out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and began practically running in the direction of his car. All day as he was hiking, Matt kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see this guy, because clearly he had followed him for multiple days over 15 miles, and so the likelihood that he's still following him was really high. And so all day, Matt just felt like he was being watched, he was totally terrified, and then the sun started to go down, and Matt knew he would have to camp out again. And so he found a clearing in the trees, he set up his campsite, and he was so tired from running basically all day and being so mentally exhausted from this experience that he just got in his tent and fell asleep very quickly. But several hours later, he woke up to the sound of somebody walking around his tent. And he knew it had to be this guy. He's still in the middle of nowhere. He's not even close to the parking lot yet. And so this guy is still following him. And so Matt sat up in his tent, he clutched his knife, and for hours and hours and hours, all night, this guy just walked around his campsite. And then around 4 or 5 a.m, he scampered off. When the sun finally came up, Matt leapt out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and literally just began running in the direction of his car, hoping that maybe he could get there before needing to camp out one more night. And so all day as he moved, he's looking over his shoulder, knowing this guy is following him. At this point, it's not even a question. He's somewhere in the forest, but he could never see him. And unfortunately, as the sun was setting, he knew he was not going to be able to make it to his car. He was just too far away. And so at some point, when it got too dark to keep moving, he had to find a clearing and set up his tent again. And so once his tent was set up, he just climbed inside, grabbed his knife, and sat there, knowing this guy was somewhere out there. And so Matt climbed inside of his tent, he zipped it up behind him, he grabbed his knife, and he sat there expecting to hear this guy come walking around. But after several hours, he didn't hear him. And Matt started to wonder, maybe this guy has left me alone, finally. Maybe he's not following me anymore. And so Matt, who was totally exhausted, laid down to go to sleep. And then as he's laying there from somewhere out in the woods,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
Matt immediately sat up. His heart began racing so fast that he actually was concerned he might have a heart attack. And he didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to say, so he just sat there holding his knife. And then this guy began running past his campsite, making animal sounds, and he would stop periodically and moan and grunt, and he'd kick up leaves, and then he'd run past his campsite again, over and over and over again, until the sun finally came up and this guy scampered off back into the woods. Matt didn't waste any time. He leapt out of his tent, packed his stuff up, and ran all the way back to his car. When he finally got inside of his car, shut the door, and locked it, he cried tears of joy. He was so unbelievably relieved. And he peeled out of the parking lot. He got to a nearby hotel. He finally got cell phone reception, and he considered calling the police about this guy. But he thought, what am I going to tell them? He didn't commit a crime. He was just terrifying. And so he decided not to call the police. He finally flew back to New York, and he just had to accept that there was some strange guy out in the wilderness of Washington state who was able to hunt him over 3 days and 30 miles in rugged terrain without the use of a flashlight, without any gear. And all he ever said to Matt was,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
Here's the sentence rewritten in proper American English. Thank you for listening to the exclusive episode of the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and are looking for more thrilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. Simply search for MrBallen podcast episode wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll find them all. Additionally, there are hundreds of other stories like the ones you heard today, available in video format on our YouTube channel called MrBallen Podcast Episode. I truly appreciate your support. Until next time, take care.